Welcome to the Digital Podcast that explores how different organizations transform the way they create and capture value with digital technology. All right, great. Well, Mark, thanks for coming.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a great honor.
Yeah. It's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. And I thought maybe we should start by you introducing yourself. Say a little bit about how you're juggling different roles.
Sure.
You're a professor, you're a board member, you're a policy advisor. You've done some work also. Well, I guess you're still doing some work on as a consultant on the side.
You've done a great job for me, Panos. You've done a great job. I'm Professor of Digital Economy at the University of Exeter Business School, a little group called INDEX, which stands for Initiative in the Digital Economy, Exeter. Until quite recently, I used to co-own and run 3 businesses specializing in digital transformation and public services. And there was a trade sale actually last year, so I have a bit more time on my hands now, which is enjoyable. I've done various policy roles over the years. I did a book called Digitalizing Government a few years ago, which has done pretty well actually. Not necessarily because we're geniuses; it's because incredibly, if you have to fight your way at airports through get rich quick via digital books, right? But when it comes to public services, 40% of global GDP, there's hardly anything about digitizing government. So hopefully we can get into that. And over the years, I've done, as you say, I've done various policy roles in the UK for outfits like Cabinet Office a couple of times. I was on the board of TechUK, the UK Technology Trade Association, which talks to government a lot. The Scottish Government, I've advised various councils, and I was on the National Audit Office, Digital Advisory Panel, and lots of things like that. Chaired the National Digital Conference for a long time, Board of Digital Leaders. So I talk about this stuff a lot, and I guess I would describe my role here. Maybe the conversation might bring this out as a kind of tech translator. I'm not a deep techie. I specialize in thinking about the implications for businesses, and particularly government and public services, of digital technology.
That's great. And if I remember correctly from your early days as an academic, you started on this multi-dimensional role from the very start. I think this was, I guess, a conscious choice, right, to do all these things at the same time.
That's kind of why I look so tired, I think I did a mid-career PhD when I was in my 30s, and I just really liked the kind of taste of academia that provided. And so I got a job, at the faculty at Cambridge Judge for a long time, and just carried on really. And I think, a lot of people say, it'd be great to do both. It's not for everybody. Some weeks you feel like a master of the universe because practice drives research, feeds into practice, and everything is brilliant. And other weeks is just kind of, missed appointments and diary clashes, and you feel rubbish at both roles. So it's not for everybody, but it works out for me. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. So what I want us to talk about, obviously, is digital transformation of government and public service organizations, and drawing from your, long experience with working with both local. I understand you're very passionate about local authorities and local organizations, but also more broadly with, government and the public sector. So, what drives digital transformation in public service organizations? What is digital for you?
Yeah, great question, because as we know, it varies for lots of people. Okay, so I'm just going to take it super simple and just to ease into this. So for me, digital transformation all comes down to the internet. It's got very little to do with websites. So what the big thing that's changed really is that for legacy organizations, and obviously government is the master of legacy organizations. I define legacy organizations, by the way, as organizations which grew up in the last couple of centuries, maybe any time really before the emergence of the mature internet. And as a result of that, they've grown up people, policies, processes, technology, siloed structures that really didn't communicate with each other and had to do pretty much everything all by themselves. So if you look at, Take the UK as an example. We have 650 NHS trusts, very powerful organisations that don't share very much. We have 43 police forces busy cutting frontline services, don't share very much. We have 430 local government organisations, each surrounded by health, social care, police, ambulance, third sector and housing organisations. They don't share very much, and they're all busy cutting frontline services. We have 1,500 housing associations, all of whom do pretty much slightly different versions of exactly the same thing. Now, that might be okay. That might have been okay in the early 20th century and in the Victorian era. The thing is now that this new exciting thing called the internet, which I think of basically just like plumbing that allows everybody to share data and capabilities now increasingly from the cloud, means one big thing in direct response to your question that's totally changed my vision of what governments, in fact all businesses, should be doing. And that basically means that over the last kind of 10, 15 years, the explosion in particular of cloud-based engineering. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about all the emerging technologies, the stuff everyone wants to use, the AI, the advanced analytics and natural language processing, the edge computer, Internet of Things stuff, the distributed ledger, blockchain type of capabilities, all of those, optical character recognition, geolocation services, all of these exciting technologies that are incredibly powerful, hyperscale power, together with all of that hyperscale heavy lifting capability, data processing capability in the cloud now, means that increasingly you are able to just stream, to consume a lot of these services like many of us watch Netflix, or we might use Microsoft 365. The problem we've got, however, is that most of these legacy organizations I've just described basically run all of their own stuff, right? From the front line all the way to the back office. And the kind of central conundrum for legacy organizations in the digital era is a whole bunch of stuff that we used to do that was really useful to do in our own separate ways, not invented here syndrome. We're special. We need to do our financial processing or our HR or whatever we might, want to do in our own special way. Now makes absolutely no sense to do that in a special way anymore, right? So effectively what we need to do is to consume ever more of these cloud-based services, replacing a lot of these sort of legacy, very clunky, expensive, unsustainable back office services with cloud. Once we can start to do that, of course, we can share data. We can join up around citizens rather than citizens joining up for the convenience of government departments. We can collect around citizens, and we can start to get a lot smarter in the way that we design public services, which are very user centric. So in summary, I think a lot of the time digital is just seen as DDAT, so digital data and technology, user-centric digital service design. Let's be agile and let's design some new services around citizens. That's part of it. That is absolutely part of it. But you can't transform your services unless you are willing to have some very difficult conversations about your back end. Increasingly, 20, 30, 40% of that back-end public services needs to go to the cloud, so that we're not reinventing the wheel again and again and again. Because citizens at the moment, we know this, you just have to glance at the papers any day, are suffering unprecedented cuts to the front line of public services, less and less funding for public services. And I'm trying to I'm doing a bit of work to try and estimate this at the moment. I think maybe between 30 and 40% of our total public service budget is probably just going on reinventing the wheel. So take the National Health Service. I reckon at least 30% and possibly 40% of the total National Health Service budget in the UK goes on non-clinical spend, doesn't touch a doctor or a nurse, but props up this horrific legacy structure, which is nobody's fault. We've just inherited it because, again, people didn't have a choice in the past. If you're an alien now and you look down on the way in which we collectively organize ourselves, frantically shutting public services at the front line whilst presiding over this enormous kind of siloed legacy infrastructure, you'd think we'd gone collectively insane.
Yeah.
So that's what transformation means to me.
Okay, that's great. And I can share also some of that sentiment. Recently taught a course to a group of healthcare professionals, from nurses, administrators, clinicians, etc., on digital transformation. And I was surprised to hear that still some departments are using paper-based records. And that's one. And then the second is that even if they do use some systems, they do not integrate, they do not interoperate with other systems in the hospital, which means that even if there is digital systems in place, there's disconnect between them, which means there's a paper trail. So you cannot avoid the paper trail. And I was completely surprised. I mean, we are 2023 now, and we're still talking about paper-based records and paper-based systems and paper-based trails.
So let me give you a case example from my own experience. And I'm quite proud of this, actually. I think it can make a case for being the most successful example of digital transformation in the NHS in the UK. It's called NHS Jobs, and you can just Google it. It's www.jobs.nhs.uk. The story of NHS Jobs is this. 2003, Department of Health notices these new exciting things called job boards, right? We're all familiar with job boards like job sites or, people, portals where you can look for jobs. And the Department of Health thought, right, well, we better have one of these as well. We better have a private NHS one to do the NHS, because the situation was, of course, each one of those 650 NHS trusts did their own recruitment. So if you're a doctor or a nurse, or if you're a hospital porter or a surgeon, and you might be in Adam Brooks Hospital in Cambridge and you want to see if there's a job in Exeter in Devon, at the time you had to buy Nursing Times, Nursing Times Devon. You paid for that, and Nursing Times Devon only sort of showed you what was available in Devon. There was no national visibility of jobs in the NHS. So it was not a good service for doctors or nurses who worked in the NHS, and it cost a lot of money, of course. So lots of little micro industries in the NHS doing all of their recruitment again and again and again. So what we did was and this is the company I ran, was to explain that, and actually, to be fair, they were listening and well up for the conversation, that rather than building an NHS version of this, there was actually at the time JobSite was a business that was running an early job board, and the technology they built was about 95% fit for purpose for what the NHS wanted. So let's say the Department of Health had instead paid a big systems integrator like IBM, I don't know, doesn't matter who it might have been, £100 million to rebuild that. Yeah. They would effectively have spent 95 million of that £100 million just rebuilding what was already there in the cloud available to government to rent, basically, before they got to the 5 million that actually added some value when you stick the NHS logo on the front or whatever. So we said, don't do that, right? We'll go and talk to JobSite. We'll do a deal with them. We'll reuse their existing tech, okay, and we'll customize it. But then, of course, we've got to persuade 650 very powerful NHS trusts who are very used to doing their own thing in their own special way to abandon that and come online and basically use this free online service. So the government said, basically via us, it said, we'll set up the service, it's online, it's free to you. So Panos, if you are an HR director in, Stoke-on-Trent, it's free. We won't charge you, just come online. It works like Google. And of course, it was a platform. It was an early public sector platform. So now you wind forward, I think it saved at least £1.4 billion. If you talk to anybody in the NHS, doctors and nurses, and you ask how they applied for their job, they'll say, oh, yeah, NHS Jobs. Yeah, it's kind of, I take it for granted, right? But I don't take it for granted because I knew what happened before. There were 650 non-value add activities, which could be just ripped through with a single platform play. So we did that with NHS Jobs. And I'm currently doing a piece of work also looking at where else we might be able to apply that platform-based NHS approach to digital transforming other services like that. So that's an example of kind of how you can do it. It is possible. I'm not saying you can tackle all of those legacy problems in that way. But it is possible to look across the landscape of public services and say, where are those areas where there is widespread duplication? We're just reinventing the wheel again and again and again. And how can we, in central government, rip through that with a platform play?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great example. And so just to dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that you said there. So, biggest challenge is basically legacy organizations, not just legacy systems, but legacy organizations and everything that comes with it. And in your book, which I reread in preparation for this, I got it a few years earlier, I have to say, but I had to reread it over the weekend, and I highly recommend as essential reading for anyone trying to understand digital transformation in the government. But you talk about this schism between political vision and aspiration on the one hand, and execution and implementation on the other. Yeah. And you go into great lengths in the book to talk about, the history of, new public management, digital government, all the initiatives that came through the years, through various premierships and coalition governments, etc. And I'm just trying to understand, so in your example, just to use the example of the NHS Jobs, right? How did you overcome this schism? How did you overcome the challenge of legacy organizations? Was it because this is a service that cuts across? And if it was a separate issue, if it was a separate project, like something that had to be done within a hospital, it would be a completely different story.
So I think it's a really good question, and so let's get into it. I think there are several factors. NHS Jobs was a great opportunity in a sense because yes, there were some data linkages with other systems, in particular the kind of payroll system within the NHS. So there were one or two, but there was heavy mandating from the Secretary of State downwards about opening those things up. So there was political sponsorship right from the outset, which is super, super important, of course. So that's number one. There was visible political sponsorship. Number two, I think it was NHS Jobs was something that we were able to identify. There was scale there. Right, so it was an activity which was being undertaken by every single NHS trust again and again and again. So the argument was much stronger that there was very little that was unique again and again and again about what was going on, and the uptake was 100%, by the way. So it's like a platform with 100% uptake and traffic. So I think doing it again, I would kind of look at I think there are the more unique the activities undertaken by a public sector organisation, if you like, the more value added those activities are. If you really cannot consume vanilla flavour, and there is a proper public value in having a bespoke suit, if you like, mixing my metaphors, building your own, then that's okay. Okay, there's a place in the middle though. So, for example, PASs, patient administration systems in hospitals. They're basically kind of workflow systems, a little bit of workflow, a little bit of sort of process management, a little bit of data transport, a little bit of document management, all wrapped into one. Hospitals, pay again and again and again huge amounts of money to large companies for slightly different versions of the same thing. Now, I think you could absolutely standardize that, but you would have to drag hospitals kicking and screaming with you to do that, because, of course, hospitals over the years have evolved bespoke processes around these kind of bespoke, customized systems. However, if you're a patient, when you go into a hospital, do you start asking questions about, I demand to know which hospital patient administration system you're using to underpin my operation or whatever? You don't care, right? Providing it does what it says on the tin. And likewise, with local services, I don't ask questions about who runs the CRM or the finance system in my local authority. Providing it does what it says on the tin, I don't care. So there is a progressive misalignment, if you like, between what citizens want, what is value add in public services to spend public money on, and often what public sector administrators want. And to be fair to public sector administrators, there are many people who want to do the right thing, who get it. But of course, we have a prisoner's dilemma syndrome, don't we? So there's increasingly less money to do a lot of this stuff. I've got to worry about business as usual on the front line. I can't just suddenly unplug all my services for a couple of years while I figure it all out. So people are very stretched. And it makes little sense for me to get going on this stuff unless you also maybe get going on it. And I know that somebody over here is getting going on it, so we can start to share something in the future. So we're all kind of caught in a bit of a trap. And it's very, very difficult. But I think there are other examples you can look at in the world, though, where, again, senior political clout has enabled things to happen. So take a look at the Singapore Smart Nation website. Incredible. They claim 99% of public services in Singapore Smart Nation are digital from end to end. I mean, extraordinary. We know about Estonia and their kind of crossroad system, again, about interoperability, politically mandated as well. Service New South Wales, so that's a kind of portal, again, that allows citizens to access a whole range of services very well. GovUK made some kind of some progress at the time because it had political backing in the form of Francis Maude and the government in 2012 in the UK. Argentina's IT program, again, all of these examples of international examples of where real strides have been made in digitizing government and overcoming the kind of inertia that you've been talking about. Every single case, there's senior digital backing, political backing.
And I guess what you also mentioned there was that it doesn't just take political backing; it also takes leadership within the public sector organizations. Sometimes you have, again, inertia within the organization itself, not the government, right?
Panos, I can always go and hire an experienced techie, right? I can always go and hire one of those. They may be expensive. The better they are, the more expensive they are, but I can always get, even despite the skills shortage, I can always get a decent techie. What I can't get to run my business or to run my department or to redesign my local authority are competent business people who understand what tech can do, but who focus on the business implications and challenges of that technology. So, if you like, technical translators. And what we lack, certainly in the UK, and in fact, most public administrations around the world, are that kind of class of person. So, in other words, people who are abreast of digital technologies, in particularly now modern cloud and emerging technologies that live in that, and who think through the impact on public value of what those technologies mean for what we should be doing and how we should be redesigning the whole structure of our public services. There are just not enough of those people. So we don't have a formal training program in this country, in the UK, to bring through cadres of people who have that capability, who can then go and hire and or commission the technologists to actually build some of that stuff or to commission some of that technology. But we don't have those people. I mean, in my opinion, put it another way, if you were a shareholder of a major organization, you're a pension fund or something, and you went to the annual general meeting of that organization and you saw the chief executive and the board up on the stage there, and you might feel justified in asking the question, okay, in 2023, the age of the digital economy, the data era, what are you doing to safeguard my investment? Okay, how safe is my investment with your kind of corporate strategy in the digital, era of the digital economy? And if the chief exec and the board couldn't answer that, couldn't present you with a coherent plan for how they get that and how they're going to thrive in that, then you would probably demand that they be fired. You'd certainly want to withdraw your investment. If you asked, I'm sorry, I'm going to get political with a small p here. If you asked any of the last few prime ministers we've had, or the cabinet, that question, you're a steward of the UK government and public services and many of our national institutions in the era of the digital economy. Can you provide me with a cogent explanation for how we're transforming to thrive over the coming century? You wouldn't get that answer from any of them. So in a sense, I think there ought to be a driving test, a mandatory, almost kind of mini technology MBA for public services that ministers, permanent secretaries and directors of public services have to go through before they're given the keys. Because at the moment, I think we are, unfortunately, being run, again, through no fault of themselves, by people who are literally incompetent to run organizations in the digital era. So I think you put your finger on a really big break to its public service transformation.
Yeah, and we will get into skills and capabilities later on in the talk. But what I want to focus on now is something you mentioned earlier, this notion of value. You mentioned that value is captured through data and obviously the cloud. opens up new possibilities for opening value. But what is different? Why is it so different from what we had before?
So for me, it comes back to, again, what we were talking about a bit earlier about how the new availability, the ubiquity, and the power of largely cloud-based digital technologies is changing what we should be doing with our daily lives. So if you look at what most leaders and managers used to spend, and for legacy organizations still do spend most of their time doing, and I'm sure this will resonate with anybody watching this discussion, they probably spend between 60 and 70% of their working day keeping the engine running. Right, whatever that engine might be, public, private sector, doesn't matter, right? Just keeping the engine running. BAU, business as usual, because it's all over the place. Stuff is breaking, we've got to try to drag it kicking, screaming into the 21st century, etc., etc. All that takes up most of our time. Then there's a bunch of sort of, maybe some HR and some things. And then probably about 5% of that time as leaders and managers, we are thinking about innovating, about improving, about experimentation, fail quickly, kind of try again, doing things, making stuff better, being bold. About 5% of our time. Most of our time, we just keep the engine running. So the big insight for me is that cloud-based technologies increasingly, and you couldn't say this 5 years ago, but because they're maturing so fast, cloud-based tech increasingly can run the engine for us. They can run it much more powerfully. They can give us access to a whole range of these incredible new technologies. And much in the way that I described NHS Jobs, right? We don't have to run it ourselves. So we can do it better, more powerfully, more sustainably. And of course, because our data is in the cloud, we can talk to and join up with other public sector technologies as well. So that's brilliant. So actually, if I can do that, if I can migrate that stuff to the cloud and run the if you like, the back end engine of my organization primarily in the cloud, then I can free myself up to do the value add stuff, right? Making stuff better, the leadership stuff, the intellectually kind of risky stuff, if you like, and the courageous stuff, from 5% to maybe 15%, 20%, maybe one day 30, 40% of managers and leaders will spend their time leading and experimenting and innovating rather again than just kind of with spanners keeping a very creaky engine running. So for me, there is a shift, if you like, in value proposition and a challenge really to public sector leaders to really have a think. How much of my time am I spending just running to keep still? That is very little. There is very little value of that in that activity to citizens, right? The valuable activity is stuff that you can't stream. So what is it that citizens care about in public services? Doctors, teachers, nurses, daycare centres, social workers, parks, libraries, roads, bin collection. They're the things that citizens care about, right? What we don't care about, again, is armies of, maybe IT support staff propping up a legacy on-premise kind of, data lake or something, or kind of lamp stack, or we don't care about that. And there's not only is there no value to people spending their hard-earned and increasingly scarce public money on this stuff, but it's also increasingly a rubbish service for all the reasons we discussed. It doesn't join up, it's not powerful, it breaks, it limits what public servants on the front line can do. And so digital transformation, potentially, the prize for me is a shift of value of public spend, but also activity away from stuff that is increasingly of no value, little to no value, and in fact holds public services back, to high value activities which are on the front line, right? They're all of those examples I gave, they're all frontline public services. So I think we're presiding as the kind of landscape I outlined a bit earlier about all these duplicate, organizations. Again, I think the ultimate prize is a shift of the 20-30% of non-value add activity that's currently locked into all of those silos into the cloud, so that we can redeploy that value to the front line, to have more doctors, teachers, nurses, public servants, more of them better enabled with better tech, working collaborative together around citizen needs. So that's the prize. So just in summary, again, and I mentioned this point, but I do want to mention it once more. For me, digital transformation isn't solely about take an example, lots of councils, each with a little digital team building kind of nice websites, okay, and talking about user needs a lot. That's a great start, but there's no point in doing that if the whole of the back end is still locked into all those silos that can't share, that is wasting all of that public value. So you've got to do both at the same time. You have to look at the deployment of infrastructure into the cloud, that sharing, that redeployment of value that then goes to the front line, and then you start to invest in redesigning the frontline services using agile techniques.
Yeah, and that connects, again, in your book, you cite Mark Foden's layered modular architecture and the ways we can break free from some of the existing silos, which, by the way, aligns very well with academic and industry frameworks that describe this new organizing logic of digital first organizations on the cloud, right? And I will add links to those frameworks in the description of the podcast. The question I have is, how do we develop such a layered modular architecture within the public sector? And how do we get rid of this, the legacy systems? And I know you have some ideas. But maybe,
I think they can operate at various levels. Okay, so just briefly for those who may not have seen it, Foden distinguishes between what he calls there's a kind of dashboard layer, which is the kind of, whether it's call center or websites or bots or so the layer that we interact with government. He's not really interested in that so much. So that's nice web design. Who cares, right? And the back end, the bottom layer, is the kind of infrastructure, the pipes and wires. Okay, so that's the kind of all of that stuff. Again, he's not particularly interested in that. The bit he's interested, he calls deliberately and provocatively Gubbins, which is a kind of, UK slang term for stuff. And he deliberately uses that because it's just stuff. But that is the difficult stuff. That's the difficult bit, because that stuff, if you like, is the process logic in organizations, how we do things. And what he says we've got to do, the task ahead of us all, basically, is so forget the top and the bottom layer, which you can consolidate and do stuff with. That stuff, we've got to separate out the special stuff where we add value, where we in our organization do a thing in a special way that is valuable for citizens to keep it special, versus the common Gubbins, specific Gubbins versus common Gubbins. And so my NHS Jobs example is a cast iron example of common Gubbins, basically redesignating Gubbins, right, which was 650 organizations doing recruitment, and going, hang on a minute, there's nothing special about that. Let's redesignate that as common Gubbins, and then we treat it accordingly and nuke it with a platform play. So that's the Foden thing. So how do you do that? It's obviously back to how we discussed prisoner's dilemma, but there are glimmers of hope. At the highest level, if I was Prime Minister for a day, I would have a bill, and I put it up there on the internet, a public services bill, which would redesignate public value. So I'd start from the top. I'd go, a bill in Parliament would go, the localism agenda. Okay, we have a localism agenda in the UK that says let's devolve, power to local authorities and local services. I would redefine that envelope of what's in that localism agenda, and I would say it's no longer, in the age of the internet, good use of public funds for you, Panos, to build your own customer relationship management system in your local authority. It's just not good use of public funds. And you can talk to me about localism and local power as much as you like, but you are still wasting your local people's money, right? Whereas it is good practice for you to, I have no idea, set your own policies and decide locally how you spend those, local money, etc. So we redefine that envelope, okay? And basically central government looks across, does an NHS Jobs, if you like, and looks across that landscape and says, you know what? You out there in local public services, we're going to take away those areas which could be platformed, and run kind of centrally, and we're going to allow people to consume those just once, okay, and then we're going to pass all of those billions of savings to the front line. Now that's what I would do, but that would require probably Prime Minister level down, right? It would require Prime Minister and a cabinet. A cabinet office which was hugely empowered, because it would meet enormous resistance, of course, from many leaders of public services, right, who would take exception to that. So, and you'd have to work through all the PR and the explanation about what you were doing, and so you could do it, right? So you could have a really hard kick, if you like, from central government to kickstart some of that consolidation of the back end of public services. Given that that's not going to happen, probably, then you can look at the middle level. So in the middle level, I've had something to do with the launch of this. There's something called the local authority digital declaration. Okay, look it up, and that's a bunch of councils getting together at council level, saying, you know what, I realise that actually, Panos, you're going to be procuring in your council a new finance system in 2 years' time, and I'm procuring one now. So why don't you and I get together and share APIs, code libraries, process diagrams, architectures, procurement documents, etc. So actually, we can then go to our suppliers and say, don't try and sell Panos and me slightly different versions of the same thing, because we're onto your tricks. We want the same thing, please, and we want to pay. And more of us are coming together to consume a single version of that, and we're going to drive the price down because it becomes commoditized. So, as we all know, the more commoditized something becomes, standardized it becomes, the more price sensitive it becomes, and you can drive it down. So that's in operation, and over something like 200 councils are signed up to that. And the back end is basically a GitHub repository with all of these kind of assets. So you can do things like that. And then I think at the lower level, right at the bottom, I think it's not just about smashing stuff together, but it's about looking at service patterns, common service patterns. And I'll give you another example, if I may, from my own experience, and I'm proud of actually. This is Swindon Council, and Swindon Council had a problem. They had a problem with fly tipping. So fly tipping is obviously when people dump waste on the side of the road. Very expensive to clean up because you have to separate different types of the waste. So you might have to separate old mattresses from white goods, from garden waste, from metal. And there are different contractors that do it. So what we did in the business I used to run is we got some very, very cheap digital cameras. We strapped them onto council bin lorries, council assets, mobile assets going around, and those cameras uploaded 24/7 street views, right? Of just going along 24/7, uploading what they saw on the streets. And then the clever stuff comes. We just used cloud-based modular service design. Oh, what does that mean? Basically just means like Lego government I talk about a lot. We said, what are we trying to do? We're trying to identify where these piles of mess are, because they're very expensive and they're really annoying citizens. And then what we want to do is to work out what's in the piles of mess, and we then need to ask different contractors to go and clean them up. Okay, so what we did is we all cloud-based Lego bricks. So optical character recognition. So once we had all this stuff loaded up in the cloud from these cheap cameras, we processed it. OCR, optical character recognition. So that allows the cloud to distinguish different pixels and start to have a look at those images. Natural language processing. So if one of those things says Zanussi on it, you probably know it's a fridge. Things like that, street signs, etc. Geolocation services. Where is that image? Then of course the clever stuff. Okay, so then the AI comes in, the machine learning. So after a while, this is happening, remember, all of the time, it starts to then understand what it's looking at and separate out garden waste and white goods and etc. And then some web services, a kind of interface that plugged all of that intelligence into the council's line of business systems. The upshot of that was that in real time, all the time, the council is finding these things. It's all happening automatically, and it's building up rosters, collection rosters for the different council contractors that say, okay, we've got a fridge here, and here. So when we've got 10 fridges, enough for you to fill a lorry, we'll dispatch you, and off you go and get those things. So that happens automatically, no humans. It was built in about 3 months for a handful of thousands of pounds. So it was very, very cheap, very, very powerful, sustainable. Citizens love it. Council leaders like it because it makes them look good. But we repurposed that service pattern. In other words, the service pattern was, where is some stuff? What do we need to know about it? Yeah, and can we kind of coordinate a response to that thing? So again, we reused it for potholes. So we reused the same thing so cameras going around the roads, this time looking at potholes. Where are the biggest potholes? What are the dimensions of them? Can we rank the most serious ones? And then can we dispatch prioritized pothole repair people to do that? So we repurposed the same service pattern, a lot of the same technologies to hit that. And then we thought, once again, during COVID, we had a similar service pattern. There were some people who are shielding, often very lonely and quite dependent, were quite keen to release details of themselves to close neighbours, so that close neighbours could come and check whether they were okay or not, but didn't want to release the data publicly. So again, putting it rather uncaringly in kind of a technical language, it's like, where's the asset? The person. What do we need to know about them? Can we triage and prioritise those assets that need kind of response? And can all this kind of happen automatically? And we did the same thing. So the same service pattern, a lot of the same technologies reused 3 times to hit 3 completely different use cases. So I do think at the lower level, so I articulated a high level government policy, which it absolutely could do to start this, a meso level one at kind of a leadership level where institutions get together and start sharing stuff. But I also think at low level, individual organizations can start to be far more disciplined about looking internally and going, you know what, this thing here, this thing here, and this thing here are actually based on a very, very similar service pattern. So we're going to start reusing those and sharing those things within our own organization as well. So there's 3 examples for you, but I think, we could talk about that for a long time.
That's fantastic. And if I'm not mistaken, you have won an award for the Swindon service, right? We
did, yeah. It won a Digital Leaders AI award, and I think rightfully so, because it was very cheap, it was very quick, and it was stunningly effective. And I think it also, back to an earlier question that you had, it also interfaced with existing legacy systems well, right? So it didn't try and reinvent boil the ocean, reinvent everything. It just said, let's build this service, use a cheap cloud-based service, and then plug it into our existing supplier commissioning systems in the council, and it worked.
And where is, you said that that's still in operation, and the 3 projects, and I guess you had close collaboration with the Swindon Council.
Yes.
And it comes back to the point we were discussing earlier, that you need a leader there to acknowledge the importance of the technology and also have the vision and the drive to see this through, right?
And not only do you not need that leader, because you really do need the leader, but also you need to give the leader something to make them a quick success, if you like. So the kind of low-hanging fruit, to use that awful phrase, you need to deliver something quite quickly. So most organizations, public or private sector, you go to, have at least one digital transformation program that's been going on for 3 years, and you say, what are you transforming to? And they go, well, I don't really know, really. We've got some digital, they'll talk about digital capability or being more user-centric, and so they're often very unable to define what they're actually transforming, because it's changed so long. But also the people in the organization have just got transformation fatigue, right? It's just been going on for so long. I'm sick to death of talking about transformation, disruption, and nothing ever really changes. And that drives to that whole point about the difference between digitization and digitalization, and I think most organizations, I'm afraid to say, that claim to be digitally transforming are just digitizing. In other words, they're taking existing processes and they're just shoving them in the cloud, really. And therefore they're trying to do the same thing, maybe more efficiently, quicker, and more cheaply. That's digitization. Digitalization, of course, transformation, is rethinking what you get up and do every day. It's rethinking your value, which we went to a bit earlier. So I do think that for leaders, it's so important to show, because leadership is not just managing something quicker and faster and quicker and cheaper and more efficient. For leaders, it's important to be able to show that you are thinking about your purpose as an organization differently, and then to evidence that. So again, the Swindon example shows, I think, a willingness to reuse components up there in the public cloud and really kind of reinvent the way that we serve citizens. The NHS Jobs example, similar. So I think it's not just doing the same thing quicker.
Yeah, and I think all the things that you mentioned, all the successful examples that you mentioned, have an element of open source innovation, democratizing innovation. I think these are terms that you used previously in some of your, also your Computer Weekly, I should say, to our audience. You are a regular contributor to Computer Weekly, and the GitHub examples across local authorities, etc. So these are all open source technologies available to everyone. They're standardized, cost efficient, etc., that allow for public sector, local authorities to democratize innovation, and repurpose services, rethink ways of doing things, etc., etc. And that's all good. But of course, then we go into more heavy organizations like NHS hospitals, or like more extensive authorities, local authorities, councils, commissioning bodies, etc., that have so many different routines, all of which are interconnected with other routines in other organizations, right? And that's where you get, and I think you mentioned this again in your book, you have this procurement of services from third parties that are historically privileged, and it's an elite group of providers or vendors. I think leaders in those organizations always feel more comfortable in sourcing services from the IBMs, the Fujitsus, the Googles of this world, than thinking in the ways that you talked about: repurpose, reconfigure, rethink our services with cheap ways and open source tools that are available publicly, as opposed to having to pay billions or trillions of pounds. So what I'm trying to say is, when you're dealing with more complex organizations and more complex problems, there's always this tendency to trust, and I'm putting trust in quotations here, the big players, and often that ends up in very difficult. I don't want to use another word. Outcomes.
So
right?
I bear the scars of this, right? This is why I have grey hair, Pam. It's a great point. It's a really fascinating point, and it goes to, I think it pulls on a lot of what we discussed already. If there's one thing I've learned, less as an academic, but in my business, like 26 years of running businesses, it's get the incentive structures right and align them with the behaviors that you want to drive. Government historically, in my view and experience, has failed to incentivize the private sector in the right way. So take a kind of 10-year outsourcing deal with one of those organizations you might have mentioned. The way the commercials work on those outsourcing deals, you've got 10 years. Those organizations will probably add value in the first 3 years. So they've got to get the outsourcing you've got to do the transition, you might make some improvements, and then they'll lock it down, right? And then they've got to make their money back and then some to make a profit over approximately the remaining 7 years. During those 7 years, they will punish the public sector for under change control arrangements for any, they basically lock down the service, right? But then the world keeps on moving. We want to do more stuff and innovate, but if I try and go to you as my supplier and say, hey, can we just tweak this or add this service or whatever, you're going to punish me commercially, because that's the way these deals work. It's payback for 70% of the time. So we are incentivizing the private sector to, every 10 years, to lock us down so that we can't innovate, we can't really innovate, can't experiment, we can't do these things, and then we have another convulsion in 10 years' time, and the other thing we do is and this comes back to the NHS Jobs example, is that we incentivize the private sector to deliver technology, right? Then all of the risk about making the technology work and deliver some value still comes back to the public domain, right? So in other words, take my NHS Jobs example. Had the Department of Health paid, let's say IBM, again, I'm not beating up IBM, but let's say IBM, for the sake of argument, that £100 million, IBM would have built a piece of technology, delivered it to Richmond House, the Department of Health in Whitehall, and then walked away with £100 million check in their back pocket, right? That would have delivered, though, remember, no value. All public sector has got at the end of that is just a machine, right? A system that's delivered. No one's using it yet. Yeah. So the clever part of NHS Jobs, and I've got to give credit to the Department of Health for this, is saying, rather than incentivize the private sector just to deliver something and then walk away with no risk, what the real risk in this business model is not actually the technology build. It's persuading 650 people, organizations, to make use of it so that we then drive traffic to the platform. So instead, let's use the private sector to do that. Let's actually, incentivize the private sector, in this case, our organization, to take on board that risk. So we were actually initially paid a small transactional slice of every transaction that went through that platform, right? So if the NHS wasn't using this platform and enjoying it, we didn't get paid. Now, that's a very, very different alignment of risk and reward. So I think, digital models of supplier incentivization like that could be very, very different. And they could achieve very, very different things, because ultimately, of course, we know, and suppliers know, that the government can never outsource risk, right? If the payments stop going out from kind of DWP, Department of Work and Pensions or whatever, there'll be riots in the streets within 10 days, right? Government knows that, the suppliers know that. That's public risk. Similarly with healthcare, so we can't, and you can't also you can't really rely on your suppliers to do a lot of that innovation. You have to kind of do it yourself. That's the leadership. That's the value add that government should be doing. Rely on the suppliers to do some of that kind of cloud-based processing and just get rid of that, so that you, as a public sector leader, can focus on that value add, that innovation. So, very quick example, I think, look at Department of Health again. I mean, that's a Department of Wellness. It should be a Department of Wellness. It's a Department of Sickness at the moment, right? So if you look at what's happening with the healthcare industry, with these kind of, these data watches, and wear one of these, I often say in 5-10 years time, probably have a chip behind my ear that gives you all my data. And you might go, oh no, but that's my personal data. But just think about it, if the bell curve of data, public data, health data is big enough, you, the government, will be able to say to me, look, by sharing your data, I can prove to you that, within one or two data points that you are, I'm very, very likely to add another 7 years of healthy, happy life to you. If you can add another 7 years of healthy, happy life because you're triangulating me with millions and millions of public data points, you can have my data. I'm all in. You can have anything you like, right? So when you start thinking about those emerging business models in healthcare and wellness, you then start thinking, why is the discussion in the NHS just about propping up failing hospitals? I mean, we've got to sort the hospitals. God, yes. But actually, the strategy, the big strategy should, of course, thinking digitally, be, how can we have a digitally informed, smart data stewardship in the public domain, so that then we can incentivize suppliers? I can license some of that data to you as a supplier to go and do some genomic research, or license some of that to big pharma, to big tech, to do those things, but retain control of the intelligence, the experimentation, of the innovation, retain the inestimable value of all of that public health data in the public domain. So that the strategic purpose of the Department of Health switches towards wellness, right? Towards kind of, to preventing stuff before all of that spend happens, which is ultimately what we want. We want to stay well, as well as be seen quickly when we go to a hospital. So we're just not thinking strategically like that in government. And there's a word for that, of course. It's failure demand. The word in public services for unnecessary burden on conversations and activities in the public is failure demand. If we can get to the failure of public services earlier, if we can keep people healthier, for example, in the first place, then they don't come to the hospitals with diabetes or whatever, and we don't have to. There is less of a burden. And again, it's back to NHS, of course. Everyone is spending 99% of their time keeping that engine running, rather than the value add activity. So I think there's a lot there.
Yeah, and that's perfect, because it leads us to my next topic. But just to summarize, essentially, we want to move away from the supplier-driven business models of the past to the more demand-driven platform businesses of the present and the future. And there's obviously, I'm very passionate, about this. I'm very passionate about this topic on, how do platforms create value? How do they scale? How do you bring the different parties on board? How does one party create pressure and the incentive structures that you mentioned? How do we incentivize one to interact with the other and vice versa? And I think the perfect example, I'm also using, a wearable, a smart device. Interestingly, again, from my own experience with healthcare professionals, we all provide our data without, we take it for granted that we give our data away for free to Amazon, to Google, to Apple, to everyone, Netflix, right? They all know so much about us. But then when it comes to giving our data, giving consent to use our data in the healthcare context, we say, no, wait a minute, I'm not giving you my data, which is interesting. It's everything you said, right? If I can be better, if I can have a better life down the line by allowing these healthcare organizations to triangulate my data and predict disease and give me guidance on how to self-manage my own disease, wouldn't that be better for me? As opposed to, oh, please have my data for free because I want to watch a Netflix movie, or please, Alexa, take me anywhere. You can be inside my home and you can find anything you want about me. And that's all right, but it's not all right for my health.
I think there's a word you just described. It's schizophrenic, right? It's schizophrenic. But it is so wildly inconsistent, my attitude towards Big Brother, the government, I'm not going to give them my data versus all of that leakage. It's schizophrenic. It's very illogical. I think the market will take care of it, right? So I think, back to the incentives, I think as the incentives to share data, for example, about health become more compelling, and as the market can show me the probability of favorable outcomes to me personally, then I will become more likely to share my data. And I think that will happen. But, I think we could accelerate the speed at which that happens. And the other thing, the final thing is, my personal, soft P politics, I think you have to sort of get into a little bit of this. My personal preference would be that data and the control of that data remains in the public domain for public good, and is licensed out to the market to do some of that kind of research and innovation investment, but the control remains in the public domain. As an alternative, I could imagine if government fails to do that and to get control of that and take a leadership role there, I can imagine on a good day to bury bad news in 3 years' time, for example, something being slipped out in the House of Commons, some announcement about an exciting tie-up with AWS or Microsoft Azure or whatever, where they're going to host all of our UK national health data, for example. I would see that as not a great outcome, I have to say. I think people who lead us in the public domain need to lead us, and they need to ultimately to manage and control that data on our behalf, and then have a mature understanding of the data processing landscape, suppliers around the place, so that they can license some of that out for public benefit. So that's going to be more likely to incentivize me to share my data, I think, than it is if I know it's all just going straight to big tech.
Yeah. And I think it's happening faster than you anticipate, Mark. I mean, Microsoft, I'm sure you heard, announced that they are investing heavily in OpenChatGPT, and they're already integrating that into all of Microsoft products. And of course, a lot of those Microsoft products are productivity services that are being used everywhere, right? From everywhere in the public sector, everywhere in the private sector. So they are already collecting data and doing all sorts of innovative things with that data. But obviously, there have been a lot of scandals in the past, and I think that's where the public and maybe it's also the media that has a role to play in this, that they tend to highlight the scandals and less so the successes. And I think that has an impact on how we perceive these new technologies. So the question I have around this is, obviously we acknowledge that there's value to be gained and generated from data. All of the things that you mentioned, and the sharing of services, the collaborating between authorities, the collaborating between local organizations, and it all comes down to data, right? But how do we address questions of confidentiality, privacy, and security?
So I had a fascinating conversation about this yesterday, and it could be, so if anyone watches this and there's a piece of work that answers this question, please, I would love to know about it. So there was a lot of discussion in the UK government, for example, about 6-7 years ago about this very topic, and the answer was seen to be data registers, right? So in principle, you try and avoid collecting lots and lots and lots of data, like a massive relational database, because then, of course, you build relationships which are revealing potentially about people in ways that is unacceptable ethically. So you try and architect data to preserve those firewalls, if you like. So there was a lot of talk about, and some countries have done a little bit of this, data registry. So, for example, under a data registry structure, there would be a data registrar, a public registrar, responsible for all data about land ownership in the UK. Let's say, there might be another registrar responsible for all data around benefits. There might be another registrar responsible for, you get the idea, right? Rivers and environmental health, and so they hold that data, but they don't put it together with other types of data. Okay, so services wishing to join up are effectively allowed to ask each of those registrars or the systems that they're responsible for a single question, right? To which the answer is a yes or no. So for example, does Panos own a property in the UK? Yes or no, right? I'm not asking you where it is. I'm not asking you to sort of stick it together with your health data or your whatever. And then I can go and then maybe I can go and ask about somebody else about some health data and ask a yes or no question. But I'm not putting it together in such a way that it can be retro fitted. So that seems to have kind of stalled a bit, a lot of that kind of activity in terms of a national strategy, to my knowledge. But that's one way forward, and I think, and a lot of that kind of that fundamental principle that we don't squirt data all over the place, but we actually come to, we interrogate with authenticated users who can interrogate data registrars and ascertain ways forward. So the interesting question was, what percentage of use cases does that architecture, that modular architecture, satisfy? And what are the types of use cases that will not satisfy? In other words, what situations would you need to be able to share that data? And is it 80-20? Is it 90-10? We don't know, right? So that's the question. I would love, because it's the obvious thing to know, right? If we can have a registrar, highly modular structure like that, where data isn't squirted around for most of public services, that's got to be quite a sustainable way of doing it, which would satisfy some of the concerns that we talked about. But what is the percentage of those use cases for which that design would be inappropriate, and what can we do about that? And I don't put myself forward as a public sector data expert, or I'm certainly not a data architect, but I would love to know the answer to that, because I think that at a policy level would be able to drive things forward a bit and provide more convincing answers to some of those very important questions.
Yeah, and I think there's a name for it. I think within the GDPR they call that data minimization and avoiding linking and all the rest of it. And you're absolutely right. It's not an easy question to answer when you're dealing with such a there's a lot of different data there about citizens, and many of that data could potentially be linked to other services, which could then run into the problems of identifying a natural person, which is in the GDPR is not allowed, right? You should not identify a natural person by linking data between services. But then if you kill that, then you're also killing potential innovation and sharing of services.
You are, and there's because you mentioned ChatGPT. I think a lot of these conversations are becoming almost out of date before we have them, right? So I was taken by the writer Jamie Susskind, who writes about AI quite a lot in a way that I find very kind of compelling. And he looks at AI and of course the Internet of Things and joining up of, so pretty soon self-driving cars, and we will get there eventually, right? The tech will get there eventually. So he says, self-driving cars, obviously they'll price drivers off the road because they'll be much less risky than silly human drivers. So the insurance companies will go stratospheric and they'll price drivers off the road. Fine. So that's a freedom that goes away. But then once all the cars are a hive mind, if you like, kind of a part of the network, then of course what's government's approach to control? So for example, you might want to shoot a red light or something, but your car literally won't do that, right? Or you might want to, go and have a look at GCHQ, and you might find that's a designated site that your car literally will not drive to. So there'll be areas of your own country that you live that you are literally infrastructurally barred and precluded from going to. So in other words, the sharing of information about where I am combined with artificial intelligence and Internet of Things starts to mean potentially in the wrong hands, or at least, I'm not thinking of some sort of evil head of state who goes, hey, I'm just going to stop Panos and going and do, but it would happen because we are not competent, right? Our legislators just aren't ahead of this stuff. So it kind of happens by default, a bit like some of the kind of public standards conversations that are happening at the moment in the UK around Parliament or whatever. It's not necessarily there's one single evil person. It's just that these things have slipped and we're not ahead of it. So I do think that, so the public data conversation we just had need to be turbocharged, and we need to start looking at how that data starts to, what happens to that data about us when it's married with AI and it's married with Internet of Things. Because we could end up with a very, very dystopian kind of control infrastructure, just sleepwalking into it.
Yeah, and this is where, having things on the cloud could accelerate into negative externalities quite abruptly, potentially, right? I mean, so all the positive network externalities you mentioned earlier about using the cloud and minimizing duplication and standardizing and so on could easily escalate out of control with the types of tools that are coming forward, and which makes it very difficult for me to ask the next question, which is around what type of capabilities does an organization need to have in order to capture value from data. And obviously we talked about many different capabilities, including using large language models like OpenChatGPT, potentially, to do some kind of workflow activity within public sector organizations. For example, running a query on particular types of data, right? I mean, you could potentially do that. You could see that could be a possibility. But then, so that could be the capability, but obviously we need to be wary of the possibilities there.
So yeah, and you're right. We've talked about a lot of examples of this, but I guess I just maybe answer that question by bringing it down to one simple formula, and I talk about this a lot. And the phrase is focus and leverage. I've written about this in Computer Weekly, but so back to the value thing. So let's say I'm sure many people have watched Dragon's Den. And let's say I'm pitching to you and you're a dragon and you've got a large pile of cash sitting here and you're trying to work out whether you want to invest in me, whether my idea is good. In the olden days, before all this technology we've been talking about, you might use a variety of criteria to assess whether or not that's a good spend of your money, right? Whether I've done my research, whether you thought I was compelling, whether you like my idea, whatever. These days, I think there's another dimension. That's your focus, right? What are you going to focus on if you give me your money? These days, I think there's leverage as well. So nowadays, what you also want, so yes, you want to know all those things and a good focus, and I've done my market research and I've got a good plan, but you also want to know, presumably, that I'm going to turbocharge that plan by leveraging the very best of emerging hyperscale enterprise grade cloud technologies and services and capabilities, basically. And actually, that I've iterated backwards and forth a bit in my thinking. So I might have had an idea, then I looked at what I could turbocharge it with and what the possibilities were, which then caused me to reevaluate the value that I was going to kind of focus on, right? The bit where I'm going to add value, and kind of going around that cycle a few times. And so that then basically I can assure you that I'm not going to burn through most of your pile of cash just reinventing the wheel before we get to the little bit that adds value. So that principle of focus and leverage, I think in the article I rather pompously called the value algorithm of the internet era or something. But actually for me, it really, really is, right? So do I invest in this public service? Is this a good use of public money? You know, am I using the cloud in the right way? All of it comes down to me, and the challenge is focus and leverage, right? So in answer to your question about how we leverage data in the best possible way, of course, look, number one, the party is in the cloud. Whether we like it or not, the party is now in the cloud, and increasingly so. So the data has to be in the cloud for all sorts of reasons, you know, mobile access, ubiquity, all the rest of it. Security, but also this is where the emerging tech is. The emerging tech lives in the cloud. So the stuff that's going to do the heavy lifting on your data is also in the cloud. So you've just got to get it. You've got to get on board with this cloud stuff. And the cloud, you know, even 5 years ago, cloud first was all about, you know, where to store your data. And you know, I've been to local authorities that said back then, ooh, I wouldn't want to put public data in the cloud because you don't know what happens to it. And then you say, okay, let's go and have a look at your server room, whatever. And you go down to the server room and it's summer. I went to one local authority. It was like this, summer. It was really, really hot. The air conditioning was broken in the server room and the server room door was propped open with a milk bottle. You know, and there are public servants saying, "Oh, but I wouldn't trust to put it in the public cloud because that's you know, we've got a real statutory responsibility on public data." So but that was the conversation 5-6 years ago. Now, of course, it's not just where the data is, but it's what you're going to do with it. So all the processing capability, that the cool stuff is in the cloud. So you've got to go there, but in turn that raises issues. Of course, it's not all upside. I'm genuinely worried, of course, about the future lack of choice between cloud suppliers. Because, you know, although the likes of Google and Oracle are trying to play catch up, at the moment, let's face it, it's AWS or Azure at the moment. So certainly UK government. Yeah. And of course, there's a lot of talk about multi-cloud, but I think in some ways it's not yet widely proven at scale. In other words, if I'm all in with AWS, does that mean if I fall out with AWS, I can then, you know, lift and shift and put it into, and yes, mesh technologies are helping with that, but I think it's unproven at scale. And the practices to support that are as yet immature at best. So that's worrying, isn't it? Of course, you know, we don't want to end up with Mr. Bezos or Mr. Gates or anybody else, you know, basically just running just a one-stop shop. That cannot be good. And it cannot be good, of course, you know, even more worryingly, you know, the pandemic showed, for example, you know, a huge reliance on cloud-based service providers, in particular Amazon, that had a marvelous pandemic commercially. But at the same time, AWS had a marvelous pandemic in government terms. So you know, the UK government span up an entire call center in 2 weeks by leveraging capabilities that were already in AWS, right? They didn't need to build it and install it, and they just switched it on, and people could work at home. Public servants could work at home, support their departments using call center technology, which just came down a browser. But surely we don't want our public services run by AWS and most of our private sector delivery run by Amazon. Now, you know, of course that's a soft political point, but it's not really, because surely that's you know, we need markets thrive on competition, and the last thing we want is a one-stop shop. So there are so many challenges with this stuff ahead, and what worries me, back to an earlier point that we were discussing, is if policymakers and leaders in public services are spending so much of their time just keeping the engine running, where is that headroom? Where is the bandwidth at the moment to engage with these tremendously difficult but hugely important topics?
Yeah. And I like your point about focus and leverage, and I guess it also links very well with some of my current thinking on ecosystems, and I think that's where you're going, that, you know, you leverage some of your own capabilities while building on some of your partners, right? And you need to know your place, right? You need to know your role and how you link to your partners, how together you build a collective value proposition, right? It's not just me as an individual organization going to market anymore. It doesn't exist. That model doesn't exist exactly for the reasons that you discuss. You need to go to market as an ecosystem with your partners, and you need to leverage each other's capabilities and strengths, right? That's the key idea here.
Exactly right. And in turn, of course, as you do that, more and more of the stuff that you used to do internally within your organization, by definition, you are doing via value chain partners. And then also by definition, the more you do that, the more pressure it puts on you to really be even more crisp about that little bit that you do that is uniquely special and that adds value that somebody else can't do better. And so it puts people and leaders, I think, under more and more pressure to articulate the focus versus the leverage, which is done by your value chain partners.
Yeah. And I have one last question. I know I used a lot of your time today, but I think the conversation was fantastic. The last question is that obviously a lot of different organizations will have different capabilities, right? So their maturity, their digital maturity will vary. And even though we can all talk about ecosystems, even though we can all talk about focus and leverage and building partnerships, etc., some will do better than others, right? Because assumingly they're more prepared, assumingly they have more skills, they have more capabilities, they have better leadership, etc. What are those key characteristics that define what's a mature organization versus, an organization that's just starting? It's a baby in this space.
So, and I think this is maybe an opportunity. It's a great final question. It's an opportunity maybe to draw together some of the things that we talked about. Actually, thinking about it to answer that. So, it has to start with the leadership. In all of my experience, it has to start with leadership. And often the leaders are pretty scared of digital transformation, so it doesn't. And so, leadership. Education. So again, it's not just about technical skills, although technical skills and capabilities are vital. It's about tech translators, people who understand and can engage with some of the questions we've been talking about, how this emerging tech changes our view of ourselves and our purpose as a society and as a public service in terms of what we should be doing every day and what we shouldn't be doing every day. A more mature understanding of the marketplace, the supplier marketplace that we talked about, which includes, of course, not incentivizing the wrong behaviors. So that's really important. And understanding that you don't, not invented here syndrome is no longer acceptable. In other words, you do have to work with value chain partners. You do have to start thinking about focus and leverage, right? And how you add value. Increasingly, of course, that drives to frontline public servants. We all want more frontline public servants. We don't care about the rest, quite frankly. We want frontline public services. That's it. If it's not frontline public services, in my book, in the digital transformation book, it's up for grabs. And possibly, wherever possible, it should be consolidated and shifted out and done by somebody at machine scale. So that's a massive challenge. I think there has to be a conversation about data. Okay, so it starts with where is our data and can we develop a kind of common language for identifying our data? So whether that's kind of data naming policies to begin with, data models, metadata, understanding where it is, and that's just not just government, right? Private sector organizations really struggle. I heard a big pharmaceutical company the other day say to me, we're awash with data, but we don't know where it is, right? We have no way of, it's everywhere, but we've just got no idea where it is. Often, of course, the data is on Microsoft, Access databases and Excel spreadsheets, which are buried on people's laptops. So that's the kind of problem. And often the data is out there in social media, where we don't know how to engage with what people are saying about us, which is very important with local public services, actually. It's not just consumer organizations that need to do that. So some kind of data maturity and, of course, ethics. What are we going to use our data for and a kind of framework for doing that? So a bunch of conversations about data. Willingness to I think, to engage citizens. Okay, so as we didn't something we didn't get really into, but but you mentioned briefly is I think the kind of democratization and involvement of citizens. So I think building up some of those user-centric digital service design skills is of course important, alongside those bigger infrastructural challenges, the real meat of it that we focus on a lot. But sure, building up some of those skills is also really, really important. Getting a little bit of seed funding to get some pilots up and running, and we looked at the Swindon example as an example to get some quick wins, start building some momentum, and then probably a larger communications budget than is normally the case in public services. If you look at a lot of digital-focused businesses, they have quite a big marketing budget. Why? Because we are shifting behavior. We are persuading people that we can accomplish the things that we're seeking to do in an organization in ways that initially might feel less than comfortable. So we have to communicate with people. We have to get out and do things in a way that sometimes public services aren't particularly mature at doing. Partly because they might think that PR and comms isn't a good use of public funds. But I think if you're going to drive wholesale behavior change, you need to be prepared to spend more time on that. So, and I think all of those things start to kind of drive each other, right? So the kind of leadership, the supplier landscape, the procurement strategy and incentivization, the skills development, the trialing of things, and the communication, and not shying away from some of those data conversations. That can start. And also, of course, back to points you've made several times about sharing. It's that embedding culturally that willingness to start sharing with other people and to understand that the internet isn't, digital economy isn't about the websites. It's about the plumbing, the internet, and what we can share and consume that way, and how that changes our whole value proposition. So I think cultural change and education are a hugely important part of that equation. And again, we just don't have that piece in the UK public services at the moment. We have digital skills. That's one thing, absolutely. But again, as I said right at the outset of this discussion, I can always hire, ultimately, a good techie. What I can't go and hire is somebody who's going to rethink my public service for me and its relationship with adjacent public services, in terms right from the kind of the purpose and the value of the value proposition of that public service downwards, and that's the real layer. I think that's the layer that this discussion's focused a lot on, and I have to say I think until we get to more widespread thinking like that, much of our digital transformation will remain at the digitization layer of just doing it faster and cheaper and more efficiently, rather than digitalization, which is what we all want as citizens.
Yeah. So digitalization of government is complex, but not impossible.
Just a little bit. No, we will get there. We will get there. I'll tell you why, perhaps we'll get there, because the money will start to run out, right? We've already had a few councils go bankrupt. We cannot carry on with the 20th century structure of our public services. They will just collapse, and then we get kind of civic disorder, and it will get hotter and hotter and hotter. The pace of tech evolution, as we know, Moore's law onwards, the amount of data you can store on a chip doubles every 18 months. It is dry. We cannot avoid this stuff. So what I would prefer to do is to get ahead of it and get the digitalized government and public services that we all want as citizens, rather than a second-rate version where we're behind the curve that we don't want, and possibly even a dystopian version. So this kind of discussion, I don't think is sort of academic and kind of just out of sort of interest. And I believe it is highly urgent and very, very directed. And it's about getting ahead of these changes, which are going to happen whether we like them or not.
Yeah. Mark, thank you so much. Thanks for being with us. It was a pleasure, even though a bit longer than anticipated.
We had fun.
But we had fun, and I certainly learned a lot from this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks.